right, hello everybody. This is Jake, the producer here, and this is a first for the Cinebums because I am hosting. I took the reins of hosting this week to do a very special episode about Crimes of the Future, the new David Cronenberg, which was probably my most anticipated movie of the year. I'm a diehard fan of the man's work and his sort of sensibilities with horror, and I had to bring on one of my favorite friends to talk about horror with. Um, his name's Lucas Naber. Thank you for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, and I was watching this movie and I couldn't help but think that it's just incredibly. I don't want to get into it right away, but it felt like something that you would have a lot of layers to dissect about it, and I don't know. It felt fitting for you to come on for this one.
Yeah, hopefully I live up to the standards of the podcast. I don't know. Definitely a fascinating movie though. I feel like it really combines, early period Cronenberg with late period Cronenberg in a way that we haven't gotten as much of as you would think.
Yeah, I noticed when I watched History of Violence for the first time a few months ago, or I think a few weeks ago, who knows. There was a definite just shift of genre. So like exactly what you're talking about. Like I think the last time he dipped in this sort of weird sci-fi horror conglomeration was like Existence, which was like 1999. So he's like it's like 20 plus years, and it was so refreshing to see.
Yeah, I haven't Existence is one that's, a blind spot for me,
Just fucking
but
crazy.
it's interesting like revisiting his stuff. I found myself more into his later period stuff than his early period stuff, which I wouldn't have expected,
Really.
with Videodrome and the Fly and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, it feels like he found sort of his footing almost. We could talk about it more later on though, of course.
Right. But it does pertain though to crimes because I think it's an amalgamation of every theme he's sort of dealt with. I don't know. It felt like a kaleidoscope of a lot of his interests to me, and I kind of agree though. Like Cosmopolis, Eastern Promises, they're just super intriguing to me. I feel like he's pulled back a layer on Cronenberg's brain that we hadn't seen before. So yeah, I can't
Yeah,
wait to talk about. Yeah, like I have a lot of my top five. We're going to talk about top five Cronenbergs after Crimes of the Future, and a lot of mine are the post 2000s that we were talking about. So that'll be very interesting to dissect. But yeah, Crimes was a script he wrote, I think, like 20 years ago, and obviously had a lot of trouble funding it because it's way out there. And then I don't know. I feel like the early 2000s is not like a prime time to produce a movie like this. And he said that a lot of like thematically things started to come up, like climate change and this progressivism and like sexual orientation started to change. And he was like, oh shit, this might be more relevant than ever. So we got the movie and I love it so much.
yeah, it was incredible.
It
I wanted
really
to
is.
I wanted to ask, did you see the original Crimes of the Future? The one that was it like a student film that he made?
The 70s movie has nothing, if not little, to do with the remake, or not the remake, the newest version. So I skipped it. Did you watch it yet?
No, I haven't seen it. I was curious if it's like the same plot or not.
I don't think
Because it
so.
is, yeah, that would make sense because it is like a very prescient plot. Um, it's interesting, like, this is something that, like I was saying, that I found the later period Cronenberg more interesting to me than the early period. And
Hmm.
something that came up in Crimes of the Future that I thought was interesting relating to like the earlier period is kind of this use of like the main metaphor of the movie as like a catch-all almost, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
I don't
totally.
did you want to recap like the plot a little bit maybe?
Could you do that for me since you saw it like 2 hours ago for the second time?
So,
That'd be
oh, this
amazing.
is terrible. This is terrible. I need to look up some character names. I'm blanking on the character names as we speak.
Vigo's name was Saul Tensor, I believe.
That's right, Saul Tensor and then Caprice.
Yeah, Lea Seydoux Caprice and Kristen is Timlin.
Yeah,
Scott
I can't
Speedman
remember
is Lang.
Lang. Okay, so the movie kind of revolves around Saul Tenser, played by Viggo Mortensen, who uh grows organs that are inadvertent, that appear to be like tumorous growths, and his partner, played by Lea Seydoux Caprice, is the one who does like the surgical process, and she
Right.
tattoos the organs, and the two of them make kind of a show out of the whole thing. And the plot of the movie, it's kind of an aimless movie, but it revolves around them being investigated by this organ registry, and basically becoming the subject of interest of an increasing like group of characters, including the character named Timlin, who works at the registry, played by Kristen Stewart.
Hmm.
um and so yeah, I don't know, that's kind of it in terms of the plot, in terms of
Yeah.
avoiding like the machinations of it.
Yeah.
um a very like, I don't know what the, it's a very, like I said before, aimless kind of plot, you know.
Yeah. A really loose structure for sure. Not a
it was
traditional structure, I should say.
it was interesting in that it's almost kind of like this like behind the scenes look at these two performers lives, and much more of like a character drama than, you know, like the body horror that I think we were kind of sold. um
Yeah. Yeah.
it's also much more aesthetically based than I was expecting. No, not expecting, I think it was more just a highlight of how much Cronenberg focuses on like the imagery of it, and how much the
Hmm.
imagery, you know, translates to his motifs.
Yeah. No, totally. Vigo's his condition, I actually wrote it down. It's called accelerated evolution syndrome. So essentially he could rebirth or reincarnate whatever his organs that are eliminated. And I think that's his, I don't know if it was hereditary or if he was born with it, but that's like his, basically his conceit for why he's doing that. Um
Okay.
and yeah, basically
Yeah,
just
and
develops new vestigial organs. And with like one of the most striking images in the film for me is like when he eats breakfast, and there's that chair he uses that's basically designed to inflict pain, in that in the case of the movie pleasure. um so basically he can enjoy his breakfast, and that image right away kind of just brought a lot of the missing pieces for me, and like within 10 minutes of the movie, of like what this movie is about, and what is he trying to say about pleasure, and the whole notion of surgery is the new sex. And like you said, like it's more of a character piece, and like there are machinations kind of like in a noir sense, if that makes sense. Like a lot of it's revolving around like drug trade, but instead of drugs it's like the plastic and the organs and all that stuff. It's hard to like concisely talk about this movie in kind of like a non-intellectual way, if that makes sense.
yeah, there's a lot in what you just said, like in the way that it's kind of hard to track like where the movie's going and what all the different pieces like all come together as. It reminded me of like Videodrome in that sense. Like
Yeah.
it becomes less about like the tangible structure of the plot and more about like what's occurring from scene to scene, like the longer it goes on.
Hmm.
And I was gonna say, to the noir thing, it does have some like erotic thriller tendencies to it.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
very much like a, there's like a little bit of a weird kind of love triangle thing going on.
Hmm. With Timlin, yeah,
Yeah,
and the two performers, yeah.
just a fascinating movie, and another great contribution from Vigo, like another great, you know, collaboration
Oh my
between
god,
them.
yeah. Like honestly, maybe one of my favorite director actor collaborations I've discovered this year. Like we'll get to the post 2000s Cronenbergs later, but they have such a great working relationship and like wildly different performances in all of the movies. And this one was very, I don't know, it was very subdued, obviously, but also really tender and complex. And he had to do a lot vocally to kind of like portray this man with an incredibly damaged innards. Um, yeah, and I think he's just so captivating, as is Lea Seydoux. and they're really interesting archetypes that are hard to define for me. But like, what's your take on Kristen Stewart? Because like I think she's a very, performance aside, like what do you think she represents in the grand scheme of this movie?
I think, this might be too transparent or like too one-dimensional, but
Hmm.
she's kind of like almost like a stand-in for I don't know what the right word is. Like I don't want to be too broad, but like just a specific type of person who is latching onto something because it's the new thing and because they want the
Yeah.
excitement of the new thing, not, because they understand the new thing, sort of.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
guess in that way, like if you want to be broad about it, she's like kind of a naive portrayal of just like the average person, where it's like she's the side of you that wants to just, see the benefits of a new thing. It doesn't
Right.
see where it's coming from, I guess. I don't know.
Hmm.
What did you make of her?
Kind of exactly what you said. I think, and I hate to use this sort of allegory, but it felt like Cronenberg saw a cell phone obsessed society and was kind of like, oh, people latch on to ideas and uh, ideologies that aren't necessarily like fully formed yet, and that's kind of evident. And you see like their process to do this performance art is like, obviously very very loose and unhinged, and she kind of latches onto it because it's like in a world that's destroyed by climate change and everything surrounding it. Like that's like the one pleasure that people are getting is this sort of this inflicted pain, this self-inflicted pain. I think her latching onto that is kind of, I think you can interpret it in just a lot of the ways that Cronenberg views just societal latching, for lack of a better term, on just so many different things. And that's for me. I don't think it's as transparent as that, but I don't know. That's why I was asking, because like she was kind of asking a lot about her character rather than many other things about the movie. And but I loved her performance a lot. Like I thought she was incredible.
She's kind of an odd fit. Um, because in a lot of ways, like it is this movie where it's like a movie of mismatched parts where it's almost like disarming how genuine the dynamic genuine might not be the right word, but how like just how layered the relationship between the two, between Vigo and Leah Seydoux is in the film. How like tenderly that's portrayed and how intimately that's portrayed, and then these pieces like the Scott Speedman character that you mentioned and his whole plot with his young son who eats plastic and the wife
Yeah.
who doesn't like that their son eats plastic, and that and then the Kristen Stewart performance kind of feel of a piece of each other in sort of almost like this different movie from the Vigo stuff with Leah Seydoux, where it's
Right.
like, he's painting such a bleak portrait of the world, and then it's just such a matter of fact, like compelling drama in the middle of it. And I don't know, it definitely makes Kristen Stewart's performance stand out because she's just so
Hmm.
much less of a human character than the others. It feels like
Right.
she's making more of a point. She's a character that's there to illustrate more of a point than she is to like inspire specific emotions.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've heard that's interesting because I've heard takes about, I guess humanity is a good word, because a lot of people were like she felt like one of the few characters that was emoting throughout the movie. And I guess in a more traditional sense, because I think the way that Vigo's character and Leia's character express emotion is so unorthodox, and she's more of a, like we said, it's like timeless and very relevant, like how she latches on to this idea of surgery is the new sex and organs being like sort of this capital basically. um but yeah, I agree though that it's kind of she's kind of a thematic device rather than a character. But I feel like a lot of that movie, that's what a lot of the movie is, because there is not a definite narrative or a definite structure. I think it's just the world and the characters, period. And I think that's I think that's what Cronenberg excels the most at, sort of like opposite something like History of Violence and The Fly, which I love. Like Videodrome and like Crash and stuff like that is very, just very narratively loose and kind of free to express all of the stuff that he's interested in, you know?
Yeah, it's very, this is like the typical like David Lynch descriptor thing people do, but I think in a lot of ways Cronenberg stuff is dreamlike in that it's
Yeah.
like okay, like this part doesn't really quite hitch onto this part if you think about it, but like when you're watching it, it's seamless, like
Right.
his stuff fits together in the way that it makes you feel and the emotions it elicits more than it does just like A to B to C to D. And I don't know, it's a movie that like I feel like not that much happens like plot wise from the beginning
Hmm.
to the very end, but it's just very dense the whole way through.
Yeah. Extremely well realized, like every Cronenberg movie, and has a very just central conceit of what he's trying to say, if not so transparent to other people, but for me it very much clicked. And I think what you said is about not a lot happens, quote unquote, is kind of like the downfall for this movie on a critical sense. Like the friend I saw it with told me from like within the first 5 minutes he couldn't latch onto a thing, um which for me is like it's all about how you perceive David Cronenberg at this point. Like I genuinely think you've had to have seen at least 5 or 6 to fully grasp what he's going for in this movie. I don't know, maybe that's just me, and because I've seen like 20 of his movies, so I think I just am in too deep. And I'm just here for everything he has to say and everything he has to do. So I don't know.
Well, it's funny. I get what your friend is talking about, like with not being able to latch on because it's a movie that for me, my enjoyment of it is more like detached than, you
Yes.
know, for example, like when I first saw The Fly or Videodrome, like those are movies that it's like you could put them on with a crowd of people and you're going to be wrapped up in it. Like some people are going to be laughing, some people are going to be totally freaked out,
Yeah.
but you're all going to have like a very strong emotional reaction to it.
Oh yeah.
And um I don't know, I feel like the more Cronenberg you watch, the less visceral the reaction is to it and the more it's like, oh okay, like I kind of see what he's doing with this and I kind of see what he's doing with that. And so it's almost like more of an appreciation for me than it is like it doesn't push the same buttons. Not in a bad way, just more in like and this is kind of what I was talking about with like later period Cronenberg versus early period. The fact that it's shocking is expected instead of just shocking, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, which is what I think a lot of people, I think he has a reputation, especially again for people who haven't delved into his work, that he is this agoraphobic, body horror obsessed filmmaker. And even The Fly and Videodrome are very introspective movies. They're not necessarily like, there is body horror elements, but there's so much intent and there's so much, like you said, emotionality behind that. Like Videodrome especially is feels very urgent. He kind of like a brain dump sort of movie. Um, but yeah, I think expectation versus like an emotional reaction is very important with this movie. Um, and like the last thing I want to bring up is what I think the deepest and the most drawn out conversations I've had about this movie is the very end, like the last shot where you can't really spoil this movie, but in case people don't want to know, the very last shot is where Vigo eats one of the plastic bars and he has like a very, in my opinion, a very euphoric look in his eyes. And I'm having struggle like having a concrete interpretation. So please, if you have one, I would love to know.
Concrete's like obviously a hard thing to talk about, but
Right, right.
I think it's sort of what he's been talking about like ever since. Even in Videodrome you have the same motif, I think, where it's like accepting change even when it's horrifying to you. So it's like it's about, he eats the plastic because he's accepted like this is my body and it wants me to be like this and I can't change it even if I'm being told that it's a bad thing. And it's like even if you can't get yourself to believe that, sometimes like you can't physically deny it anymore. And I think that that's sort of what he's realizing. It's like the catharsis of all those emotions at the end.
Right.
Since we're talking spoilers like this, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of my interpretation was that like the boy who's eating the plastic at the beginning, he's got like a complete set of new organs that enable him to eat like processed materials.
Yeah.
And I was under the impression that the movie is about like Vigo's body is trying to grow him that same system of organs, but he continuously removes them so it's not able to complete the process.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I didn't know if it was that. That's interesting because I didn't know if the cold opening is where the kid obviously eats the trash can, which we alluded to earlier. I
Mm.
didn't know if that was necessarily. I think you're right that it's him developing a new set of organs, but I didn't know if that was like if he was the first wave of that human being. I guess I don't know. That's kind of what I was struggling with, but
Well,
um
so I don't know about the timeline either, but I thought it kind of was supposed to be a comment on like climate change, you know, like this idea that we have now polluted the earth or rely so much on processed materials that like
yeah,
our bodies are regurgitating. Like, so that's kind of where I got that from.
yeah, no, yeah, totally right. I was unsure if like again he inherited from his parents because like their reactions were both so polar opposite of each other. So
Oh,
I was
it had to have come from his dad because his dad's eating like the chocolate bar,
right,
right?
exactly. So I
Okay, yeah.
was
So I think that's the proof that they're genetically passing it on, maybe, right?
mhm,
I guess that would
I
be
don't
what it
know.
is.
I don't know. That's the way the movie bookends is what bewilders me the most, but that's why I was kind of asking you because having a second watch and a new perspective on things is always good. But
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I was still wrapping my head around like even just what the movie was. Because to be honest, I kind of went into it like expecting body horror and stuff coming off
yeah,
of like
yeah,
Scanners.
yeah. Scanners is like one of uh kind of the birth of his obsession with body horror, I would say. Like that in The
I
Brood.
was
And that's like,
shocked at Scanners, so many shootouts, like so many just
yeah,
drive-by shootings in that movie.
it's essentially an action movie when I was kind of shocked. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot, there's so many. Um, but the last scene is just incredible.
Oh
Um,
yeah, of course.
so good. Welcome back, everybody, for the David Cronenberg centric episode. And as promised, now we're going to do our top five favorite all time David Cronenberg movies. Lucas, if you'd like to go first with your number five, and we'll just, I guess, ping pong back and forth.
Yeah, so my number five is A History of Violence. I don't know if that's higher on your list or not.
It's my number three.
Okay, we can wait to talk about it then if you want to go to
No,
your
let's do
five.
it now. Let's do it now.
Okay, okay. Um, so I don't know. It's based on a graphic novel. Is that correct?
You know, I think I might have been misinformed when I said that because I think we were talking about it. I feel like
Yeah, you might have been the one that told me that. That's right.
I think this I was misled because the script feels so inherently like a graphic novel, but I looked
Well,
at
I thought,
the writer's credits. He's like he writes for a lot of superhero properties, so I'm like I assumed it was a graphic novel, but I think it just might be an original screenplay. So
okay, cool, cool, cool.
my fault on that one.
No, so I thought the same thing about Eastern Promises. I thought they were both graphic novels, and I guess neither of them is.
Let me fact check Eastern Promises, but
Well,
go.
Stephen Knight wrote that,
Yeah, I
so
was gonna say, but that could be an adaptation.
I don't
Um,
think so. But anyways, so A History of Violence, you know, yet another contribution with Vigo, another sort of entry into the late period Cronenberg, you know, a lot less like actiony, a lot less body horror, but
mhm.
a really interesting like kind of thriller, I guess I would say. Like I just found myself, you know, this is something I was going to say when we were talking about Crimes of the Future. he's not necessarily like into the body horror insofar as like making stuff just for the body horror
Yeah,
anymore. It's more like whatever he makes, he goes as hard into it as he can. And in A History of Violence, like the family dynamic is what really stood out to me. Like you have
yeah,
this great, like really showy, really dramatic Vigo performance. And then kind of like a very angsty teen performance. I don't know the actor's name. From his teenage son. Yeah, you also like this movie. You said it's your three. So what were you gonna say about it?
yeah. My number three. As I preached that I'm such a Cronenberg fan, I haven't seen. I saw this for the first time semi recently. So, um, yeah, I think Enraptured is the best way I could describe this movie. In such simplistic terms, because it is such like an all-American family, and kind of the juxtaposition against a very violent group of antagonists, basically. And it's kind of one of those movies that just kind of it's a snowball effect. Like it's one moment that sort of just propels into just an insanely violent and erotic and crazy character journey, basically. um I think mainly I'm maybe would wager that it's his most accessible film aside from The Fly, because that was a movie that my dad had recommended to me for ever. So I think like super palatable for a lot of people, but also so structurally interesting, and character wise is super intriguing. So I think of what we were talking about, that phase of like post body horror stuff. I think that might be his magnum opus. But yeah, I love that movie so much.
Yeah, it's a great one. A great Maria Bello performance.
Fantastic. Yeah.
It is too, just like you said, like definitely his one of his most accessible movies. And just a great demonstration of how like he can do, like he could just be making straight like character dramas if he wanted to. Like he could
Yeah.
just be making like crowd pleasing kind of, exactly like History of Violence. But yeah, did you want to do your five?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, um, this kind of goes along the same lines as that in terms of the period it came out, but Cosmopolis is my number five, based on the Don DeLillo,
The
uh,
Lilo, maybe? I don't
DeLillo,
know.
um, the essayist and novelist, who I'm not familiar with, but I love Cosmopolis. I think the closest thing he's ever gotten to a satire, if you want to call it that. I feel like that's such a base way of looking at the movie, but I think post, I think actually always he's been obsessed with American capitalism specifically, which is interesting because he's Canadian. But I think he's so perplexed by the American financial institution and how like certain patterns in the way our market works is just so absurd. And that's how I perceive that movie. I realize I feel like to fully grasp that film, I think you really have to be familiar with the author's work more so. In terms of the movie, I think it's incredibly smart and hilarious. Like we were saying with Crimes of the Future, like super loose in structure. You follow Rob Pattinson in this limo as he's attempting to get a haircut, and he basically runs into a lot of old colleagues and just um I guess representations of people from his past that all kind of represent people he's fucked over, because he's like a venture capitalist, like a crazy mogul. And at the same time, there's like a huge uprising against basically capitalism. It's so broad and so dense, but to me, I think it might be his one of his most ambitious movies. So I think that movie's endlessly fascinated. Robert Pattinson's incredible in it. Paul Giamatti in a surprise performance. And yeah, I mean, have you seen that movie? I should ask.
Yeah, that was gonna be my four actually, so it works
Oh,
out
perfect.
perfectly.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's an amazing movie. I also am not familiar with the Don DeLillo novel, so maybe we're just completely talking out of our asses here.
Oh, totally am.
Um,
Yeah.
I was gonna say that it might be higher on my list if I knew more about the source material, because just like this
Mhm.
incredible Robert Pattinson performance, as you said, kind of just like driving the limo around. I don't think you mentioned though, like as sort of as he loses his fortune, it's like he's made a series of bad investments, and now like as he's driving around in his limo, he's hearing every single one of them sort of come back to haunt him as like his whole thing comes collapsing down. And
Right.
then the
Right.
protesters like pieing him in the face and throwing stuff at his car. Just a great movie. Again, it's funny, like part of the appeal with Cronenberg is like every single one of his movies. It's funny, I'm realizing as we're talking about it, like it's kind of what Jordan Peele is almost going for now, where like every Cronenberg movie is an event in a different way. Like none of
Oh
them,
yeah.
feel the same. And like just, as I was talking about with like really going for it in the small town family drama of History of Violence, Cosmopolis is like this very it's an adaptation of a novel, as we've said, and so it's a very novelistic like approach. It's like lots of long conversations that don't sound like the conversations people really have,
Yeah.
lots of like metaphors and just abstract ideas in it, and just yeah, just a great movie.
It really is, and oddly, I guess not oddly, but one of his most divisive movies, I would say. I think I don't know if it's hard to grasp for people, but a lot of people say it's just super self-indulgent, and I kind of hate that term with Cronenberg because obviously everything he makes is fucking really self-indulgent. Um, but yeah, that's my number five, and I think my those that and History of Violence are my favorite in that sort of phase of Cronenberg. So that was your number four,
Yes.
Cosmopolis.
Yep.
Um, should I do mine? Because
Yeah,
my
go
number
for it.
four, because my number three we covered History of
Yes.
Violence. Um, okay, yeah, number four is the most obvious choice, but it has to be in the top five. It is The Fly, um, a remake. Well, I think top five greatest remakes ever, especially in the horror genre. And uh accessibility isn't that's definitely a term I always use with this movie, and like something I'll always recommend to anyone who is trying to get into the horror genre, or like even the body horror genre, if they're not familiar with it. I think that's the alpha and omega of the genre of just a strictly body horror movie. I think that's the peak, because of its simplicity, because Jeff Goldblum's character is such an everyman, um, just a person who let ambition get the best of him and sort of falters in the face of nature and evolution, sort of taking its toll on mankind. Um, and yeah, I mean, what's there to say? The Fly is like regarded as one of the greatest horror movies of all time, and I feel like not including it, and I'm not like calling you out or anything if you don't have it, but I feel like how could you not include it? Because I think that it introduced me to my love of Cronenberg, because I think that was like the first or second I've ever seen from him. So yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's funny too, like when you go back through his movies, like that's another one where it really is built around just this fantastic, as you mentioned, Jeff Goldblum performance. Like,
Yeah.
um,
Oh yeah.
one that I don't have on my list because I haven't seen it, but I'm very excited to get to is Crash, because that's the James Spader one. But even like in Videodrome when it's James Woods, like Cronenberg clearly just knows how to pick his leading men in such a way that like he's getting at something with them. And really more than like anything else you see Jeff Goldblum in, he really latches onto like this part of the whole sort of persona he has, which is like Jeff Goldblum really wants you to like him. Like he really
Hmm.
wants you to get what he's saying and get what he's getting at and like understand his point. And that really comes through in his performance of that movie. It's just I don't know, you really said it all. Like it's not a movie that I could say much about. Like it's a very I haven't seen the original, but it
Me
is just
neither.
one of the greatest horror movies ever.
Yeah. I mean, what hasn't been said, and I think that's interesting about I think he does. He has a really deliberate choice when picking like James Woods or Vigo or James Spader. And in the case of Goldblum, it is like deconstructing his sort of complex persona in a way. It's like really picking at his overly ambitious but also kind of vulnerable sensibilities of just as an actor, as a human being. I think it's just one of the greatest, if not the greatest performance in any David Cronenberg movie. And yeah, that's I'm pretty much out of things to say about it, but it's so damn good.
It really
Um
is.
yeah,
So
and
are we on my
so
three?
we're on your number three. Yeah.
Okay, my number three is The Dead Zone. Yet another I don't know, this one's maybe a little high on my list. I don't know. A lot of people probably don't have it in their top fives, but just a great performance from Christopher Walken. Um is that, am I mistaken, or is that one the one, is that based on a Stephen King novel or no?
Yeah, it definitely
Yeah,
is.
that's what I thought. If it wasn't, I was gonna say it's the most like King of his movies, but that makes sense. Like it's a very, I don't know, it's got that sweeping kind of scope to it. Like I love the way that it goes from being sort of like this guy who, his romance is lost because he had this strange thing happen to him and the rumors are spreading through the small town. And then it jumps into being almost like this political thriller.
Right.
Um, just a very 80s movie. And like we were talking about with Scanners, like that's another movie too where it really doesn't pull its punches. Like other than sort of the supernatural stuff in it, it's not like the most body horror based movie, but it really goes for it when people are killed off and stuff. And so yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
really like that one. That's a fun movie.
yeah.
Have you seen that one?
It is. It would, in like full disclosure, that was one that just didn't click with me as much. Um, I think I was just thrown off by the marriage of Cronenberg and King. I felt like he was battling against just two very audacious storytellers, just kind of clashing in their sensibilities. But that might just be my hangup because I feel like Cronenberg's adaptations are usually so loose on the source material, but I don't know. But I do agree, like it spans a lot of time, and I think that comes across really effective. Walken's great, and I remember the political turn is very jarring, but it is super like 80s and fun and like um really
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, the very end is very effective. I think the whole political assassination thing is super smartly done. Spoiler
yeah.
alert.
it's
Shit.
another um it's another one that's more accessible, I think. Like I think that might
Right.
be part of what you're not responding to it, is it is like an 80s blockbuster, and it's very much of the sensibilities of that
Hmm.
time. Like the characters aren't super deep, like they're not super layered. And then I'm not sure, like you said, how much of how people interact in that movie or what he's getting across in that movie even comes from
Exactly.
King. So I get what you're saying for sure.
I feel like Stephen King, I haven't read The Dead Zone. You might have more to say about that, but I feel like in 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 King fashion, I feel like he would have much more of an empathetic viewpoint towards Walken's character, where in kind of similar Cronenberg fashion, he feels just very cold and disconnected, and I feel like that's kind of the whole tone of the movie. So I just felt like it was just an odd pairing, but like Brendan, my roommate, shout out to Brendan, that's like one of his favorite Cronenbergs too. So maybe I'm just in the minority there. I don't know.
It's I don't know. It's another one where like when you're talking about Cronenberg, like sometimes the appreciation is more like for the parts than the whole. And usually it should be
Right.
like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But I don't know. I just love all the parts of the Dead Zone. Like it's a very
Mhm.
stitched together movie where all three of its acts are like interesting to me. But so then
That's
we're on your
fair.
two.
Yeah. No, yeah, and that actually, yeah, my number two I'll get to. But yeah, that actually does make me want to rewatch Dead Zone. I feel like I gave it a not a fair shot.
It's
Um,
on HBO Max.
shit, I might give it a
Free
run.
Cronenberg.
I might give it a run. Although I'm pretty sick of. I've been watching his movies pretty incessantly for the past like 2 weeks. Um, but yeah, number two. I don't remember if you mentioned if you really wanted to see this. I think you did. I don't think you have seen it, but my number two is Crash. Um, Sort of the quintessential uh Cronenberg movies post Videodrome, in my opinion. I think also a great companion piece to Crimes of the Future. I think it it very expertly deconstructs what kind of the relationship between pain and pleasure. I'm kind of toeing the line because like you haven't seen it, right?
No, I
So
haven't
I
seen it.
really don't want to discuss any plot details.
I know the basics.
So you know, like James Spader essentially gets into a bad car accident and he's disfigured, and he kind of finds this secret society of people that kind of similar to Crimes of the Future. It's like this sensationalizing their injuries into more of a sex thing. Like they use their injuries to enhance their sex lives. And again, like it's like similar to Crimes of the Future, it's very loose in structure and narratively very loose. But all I'll say is that it's his most erotic movie. And kind of what you were saying about History of Violence, like I could have seen him go on to make a million of these erotic thrillers, which would have been amazing. And yeah, I James Spader and Holly Hunter are both so incredible in it. Like they really understand the aesthetic and the whole I guess how graphic and heightened the tone of the movie is. I think just everything is so perfectly calibrated in that movie, for his intent and tonality of it, and just how gruesome and but also erotic it is. It's blending just so many different tonalities in one movie, and just kind of it's so seamless in my opinion. But again, not for if you disliked Crimes of the Future, anyone who's listening, you will not really like Crash. So that's a fair warning. And the last thing I'll say is J.G. Ballard wrote this book, who's a great writer. He wrote High Rise and Empire of the Sun. He's sort of like, I always describe him as like a dystopian modern storyteller because he kind of blends two different worlds, like this dystopian sort of drab world, and then put it into a modern setting. And I think he's one of the best at that. And I think Cronenberg's one of the best at that. So I think it was a great pairing and a great adaptation. And you should definitely check it out soon.
Yeah, I gotta watch that. I had no idea the High Rise guy wrote it.
Ben Wheatley's High Rise is also a really
Yeah, that's a great movie.
great, just trippy dystopian movie.
So we're on my two though.
Yes, you're number
That
two.
is The Fly. We already talked about it.
Of
Of course it's on my top five.
course.
I don't know, we already said everything there is to say about it, but just something that I wanted to bring up is that like that's the only time that like he really hits like sci-fi for me.
Yeah.
And I think that that's like a big part of sort of that group of directors that he gets paired with, like Carpenter, Romero, like the horror genre movie kind of guys. Like that's the one movie where he intersects with them, you know? And that's kind of
Sure.
much more my I mean he does in other things, but I don't know, in The Fly it's just like, yeah, this guy makes this strange chamber and then a strange accident happens and he becomes a fly. And it's not like, you know, that's a movie that weirdly has like a very rigid plot to it.
Oh yeah.
And I latch onto that. You know, my number one is totally different from that, totally left field, but I don't know, there is definitely something I respond to in just Cronenberg like using all of his tools to just tell a very straightforward plot. Like just this is the story, this is
Mhm.
what happens. And all the sci-fi bent, you know, comes from the plot as opposed to like being outside of that structure.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I have nothing else to say about The Fly, but yeah, that's great. I mean,
Yeah, that's too much fly talk.
I what might be his objectively his best movie. I think we have the least amount to say about it, but I kind of
Yeah,
find
fair.
that with most of like the so-called greatest movies is where I don't have a ton to say because it's just so transparently great. Um, but yeah, that's amazing movie.
Oh yeah. So you're one?
Yeah, I think we have the same number one, but I think before I say that, I have a few honorable mentions. I'm going to talk about them really fast, but
Yeah.
just because I've seen most of his movies and I feel like I'm leaving stuff out, so I just want to be fair. Um, my number six would be Crimes of the Future. Honestly, if I were to include it, like just go back to everything we just said, it's amazing. Maps to the Stars is another one that's borderline satirical movie. It's got an incredible cast. It's kind of a sci-fi dystopian look at Los Angeles and kind of the absurdities of Los Angeles lifestyle. So I think that movie's super fun. And Existence is, I just want to mention that because you mentioned sci-fi, and that movie is essentially, I think it has a lot of similarities to The Matrix, especially involving virtual reality and sort of that concept, which in 1999 was such a hot button and kind of attractive source material to have. And I think he was capitalizing on that. And that movie is just such a blast and so mind bending. And there's great action sequences in it, and there's great body horror. And it's kind of, I'm kind of at a loss for words for it because I haven't seen it in a long time, and it was such a mind bending experience. But yeah, Existence was great, and
Yeah, I gotta see that one.
I think it's incredibly up your alley. And anyone who's sort of into like 80s and 90s action, and then kind of like that kind of blended with the Cronenberg movie, it's just so fun. Like his Total Recall, I guess, is the best way to describe it.
Okay. Yeah,
It's
that
so
sounds good.
it's so crazy, and Jude Law is amazing. Um, yeah, I think we have the same number one. I would be shocked if we don't, but Videodrome is
Oh,
number
wait,
one.
wait. You didn't say Scanners. You didn't even mention it.
That's not in my honorable mentions then.
Oh, wow. Wow,
Shit. Wait, is that your
have to
number
be
one?
my honorable. No, no, no. That'll have to be my
Go
honorable
ahead.
mention
Sorry.
then.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot you.
Um, oh, you're good. No, we got to talk about Scanners, you know. Stephen Lack, Michael Ironside as Daryl Revick. That's just a great movie. Um,
It's amazing.
I was gonna say it's funny you brought up like him clashing with Stephen King in the Dead Zone, because I kind of feel like Scanners is just him making like a Stephen King movie.
It's
Like I
exactly
feel
what I
like,
think.
yeah, he just wanted to make like a cool 80s Stephen King psychic movie, and that's exactly what he did.
Right.
That's a great movie.
I should reiterate, I didn't mean like their sensibilities are wrong for each other. I just think it's hard for him to adapt such like a behemoth's work like Stephen King.
Oh
Um,
yeah, definitely.
because I think they do, obviously, like they're both incredible horror filmmakers and writers, So I think that's a good description, though. Definitely, like that's kind of like a Stephen King movie that wasn't written by Stephen King, if that makes sense. And
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be top five. I just, we got to mention it on the
that's
Cronenberg
fair. No,
podcast. Like,
that's
yeah,
fair. I can mention five more if we had more time, but on it, like I seriously, there's so many I love. Like The Brood is great. Um, real quick, A Dangerous Method is so bizarre. I don't know if you
oh,
know
is that
about
the Freud
the
movie?
Freud movie,
I've never seen
um,
that one.
which is essentially a love triangle with Vigo, Keira Knightley, and Michael Fassbender. And yeah, it's exactly what you think of a Freudian love triangle
Wow.
thriller. Wasn't quite my bag, but definitely intriguing.
That's wow. Yeah, I gotta check that out.
It might secretly, you might think it's a masterpiece, and I wouldn't be shocked because like a lot of people will say like, oh, that's like one of his masterpieces after like History of Violence. I don't know. It didn't hit
That's
for me
so
though.
funny.
It was
That's
it's
so
just
funny.
it's so bizarre.
He's definitely
Um,
got, a through line to his work, I guess.
oh yeah, absolutely. And then um
All right, yeah, sorry, I cut you off. You were gonna talk about Videodrome.
that is my number one, and kind of my default answer. If someone was going to ask what my favorite horror movie was, it'd be like I'd probably say that or the original Halloween. Um, everything we've been talking about is sort of leading up to this, in my opinion. I think what works in certain movies and what doesn't work, and what does work strongly in other movies, and I think this is kind of just his peak as a storyteller and the most meta of all of his movies in a way, because I think the movie in and of itself is commenting on how fucked up it is that people are so into his work uh and yeah, the theme, it's a blatantly obvious movie in terms of its themes, and I think that is so, like you were saying about the 1980s, I think that's such a perfect approach to that movie. And then James Woods is such a sleazy character in that movie, and yeah, would I mean it's your number one too. I mean I think it's a horror masterpiece. I think it's so profoundly scary and so deeply unsettling with how it continues to be relevant, and it continues to be as pathetic and as and kind of like an oracle to see the future and how we perceive television and entertainment, and while also being an incredibly entertaining movie from a filmmaking perspective and a narrative perspective. Like it's incredibly entertaining, but also incredibly bleak. And but I can return to it anytime. It's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, it's one of those formative kind of movies. Like you might, feel differently. Like I felt differently about it from viewing to viewing, but there's definitely like this whole strain of horror movie that doesn't exist without Videodrome. Just aside
Sure.
from everything that it has to say, like as a movie, um, you could kind of credit all of the prestige horror that we talk about now, like all these
Yeah,
movies
yeah,
that end with like, oh, I'm having a conversation with myself in a room with one white chair. Like it's kind of the start of that. And yet at the same time, like, this is a movie where like James Wood grows a gun out of his arm at one point. Like
yeah,
it's it's this movie where like everything in it is disgusting and gross and terrifying, like you said, but in a way where it all fits exactly what you're expecting when you go to see a movie. It's like he's saying,
yeah.
like, here, this is what you want, and like you're disgusting for wanting it, but here you go
Mhm.
anyway.
Right.
And that's a fascinating, like, it's a fascinating thing to think about when you think about like the gun growing out of his arm. It's like, very similar like a studio saying like, okay, well, you have this idea for a movie, like here's all this money to make it, like here's all this success, like, but what are you putting out there? Like, are you giving people a product that's actually worthwhile? It's almost like a very, like you were saying about it being so meta, like it's obviously a statement on, his process of creation. And
Yeah.
I think in some ways his willingness to be a part of that process and, his feelings about that.
I think he fully sees himself as Max Wren, aka James Woods in that movie. I think kind of going back to what you were saying in Crimes of the Future, like sort of willingly accepting a change to your body and a change to your psyche. And I think that movie is maybe the best translation of that in all of his films, because like the growing of the gun, the increasing amount of uh, times that his body deteriorates in the name of the whole long live the new flesh cult, and this, of course, this violent obsessed society that he's taking advantage of in the name of capital gain. um to me, yeah, like formative, like it kind of sets the precedent for all of his movies going forward and what he's interested in and what he wants to deconstruct. And just me as a horror fan, like it looked beyond like a normal slasher or a normal ghost movie to tell like an allegorical horror movie is the best way I could describe it. And in my opinion, compared to a lot of his movies, really simply and cleanly told, while also being a bit of a clusterfuck of ideas. I don't know. I think it's just perfect in every way.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's I don't know, there's not much more you could say about it. It's one of those movies that speaks for itself, and really everyone's seen it. Like, and if you haven't seen it, like you got to just go check it out immediately. I will say too, like it really is a movie that can be viewed any way you want to, because like I've seen it, very late at night all by myself and just been terrified by it, and then seeing it, with a crowd and like
Yeah.
some of it's like very hilarious, and I think intentionally so. And that's always been a big part of Cronenberg, is like making you laugh at things you don't want to laugh at, and
Yeah,
making you, scared of things you don't want to be scared of, and so on and so
yeah.
forth.
There's aspects of his descent into madness that's genuinely hilarious. Um, like there's scenes where he is. I think there's an S&M scene with a television that's again is
Yeah.
extremely striking and deeply terrifying imagery, but it's also it's kind of like an absurdist moment. Um, and I always like when he gets absurdly comical. And I think a lot of that happens in Crimes of the Future too. Going back to that, I think there's a lot. He's carried that sense of humor throughout a lot of his a lot of his work. So yeah, that's our number one, man. That's the best Cronenberg
Yeah.
objectively. I mean, 2 out of 2 people think so. It must be true.
Yeah, we nailed it.